Just checking earlier to make sure they didn't have a lot of plastic wrap on them. All right, well, welcome everybody, and thank you very much for joining us here today. My name is Richard Nephew, and I'm a senior research scholar and program director here at the Center on Global Energy Policy at Columbia University. I'm joined by Jack Lew, visiting professor of international and public affairs here at the School of International and Public Affairs, and a partner at Lindsay Goldberg. I am certain that Jack is a well-known figure to everyone in this room, but it really is only upon reading through his biography that you get a full picture of the range of positions and responsibilities that he has had in his career. He most recently served as the 76th Secretary of the Treasury, covering President Obama's second term. But in the Obama administration alone, he was also Chief of Staff to the President, Director of the Office of Management and Budget, Deputy Secretary of State for Management and Resources. In the Clinton administration, he served as OMB Director also, as well as its Deputy Director and as a Special Assistant to the President. He's been a Managing Director and Chief Operating Officer for two different Citigroup business units, Executive Vice President and Chief Operating Officer of NYU, and a legislative aide to, among others, Speaker of the House Tip O'Neill. In his long and distinguished career, Jack has had the opportunity to really shape, influence, design, and direct U.S. economic statecraft in a variety of ways. And it is this subject that we're going to discuss here today. Economic statecraft is something that, while a bit amorphous and difficult to pin down at times, has been a persistent theme in U.S. history. And arguably, you could say the Revolutionary War was an example of British statecraft done very poorly. And economic affairs have been at the core of U.S. foreign policy since. But only really since after the First World War, and especially after the Second World War, did economic statecraft in the United States become a matter of global import. Since the end of the Second World War, the United States has become the world's leading economy with the ability to affect business decisions around the world with the merest glance. And that explains in part why you'll very rarely see Treasury Department officials talking often to the media, especially when you could have market-moving information. With the conclusion of the Cold War, the United States took an unrivaled position as a global political and economic superpower. And in time, the United States began to use that position, not least in the development and use of economic sanctions. In many ways, this U.S. dominant position has been a boon to the world, offering a stable currency and location for holding financial reserves, as well as an open economy that helps to facilitate transactions the world over. As one colleague of mine is fond of noting, $17 trillion go through the U.S. financial system every day, which is the size of the U.S. economy altogether. And this has benefits for many, not just the United States. But with the election of Donald Trump, we have a markedly different U.S. political environment, and potentially one that will be decidedly more hostile to global commerce than in the past. We also have a president who is more inclined to use the economic tools of state in a manner that is outside of the norm, to say the least. And this is, of course, why we're convened here today. We'd like to be able to tap into the experience, the knowledge, and the wisdom of Jack Lew to help understand where we are and where we've come from in the last 30 years of economic statecraft, so that way we have some sense of both where we can go and where we may be going. Those may be different things. And we'll begin with a bit of a discussion between the two of us in which we'll touch on many of these various different issues. At that point, the audience, we've got a microphone that we'll pass around, and we will also be taking questions from outside of this room. This event, like all those at the center, is being webcast live, and both the full video and a podcast recording will be available on our website and on iTunes in the coming days. For those of you who are watching online, you can pose a question to Jack via Twitter by using the hashtag CGEP events, as well as my personal Twitter handle at Richard M. Nephew.
When I think about the last 20 to 30 and try to boil it down to just two or three things, I'd say that one thing that has changed is the delineation of executive authority through statutes that give the president and with the delegation subject to compliance with the law. That's created a flexibility of designing programs in place, and also the ability to remove them so that you can use sanctions as an effective tool to drive foreign policy. Sanctions, after all, are not first and foremost a means of putting punishment in place, though there is something punishing about sanctions. It's really designed to drive change. And you have to not just have the ability to put sanctions on, you have to be able to take them off when you've achieved your purpose. And if that was something that was subject to legislative approval, it would make the whole regime very different. So that's one change. There's a whole set of laws and an alphabet soup of laws at that. Second, I would say, is globalization. And by globalization, what I mean is the use of the dollar, the integration of the global economy, the fact that not every, but the vast majority of global transactions in some way touch the United States or the dollar, is at a level that is unprecedented in terms of its scope. Since World War II, it has been growing. Since the end of the Cold War, it's included parts of the world that were not in the same family before. And it has created the ability for the reach of the United States to go far beyond the borders of the United States. And we'll get to that later, I'm sure, as we talk about the advisability of unilateral action and particularly secondary sanctions. Third, we've learned a lot. In the years from when I started working on sanctions from the perspective of the State Department to the years I was in the Treasury position, we developed, even in that 6-7-year period, 8-year period, a much more sophisticated approach to targeting sanctions. In the early days, sanctions were quite blunt instruments. An embargo, you cut a country off. Everything is the same unless you make some minor exceptions for things like life-saving medicines. If you fast forward, and I know we'll talk more about this later, from the Iran sanctions to the Russia sanctions, we developed the ability to use more surgical tools to put pressure where we wanted pressure to be, and when we needed to and could, to make sure the unintended spillover effects didn't have the effect of making it harder to keep the focused pressure on the intended target. And again, I think we'll talk about that a little bit more, particularly with regard to the Russia sanctions. I would say that what the three things that I just went through, the scope of executive authority, the globalization, and the higher level of skill to target, the sanctions that we now use are one of the most powerful ways we project our foreign policy objectives. In many, many instances, it creates an enormous space before you have to even think about using force, which I think is actually important for both the foreign policy reason of being something that helps you accomplish your objective, but not inconsequentially reducing the likelihood of what is called kinetic options, right. Military force. When I think about issues, again, as I'm sure we'll discuss, like the potential overuse of sanctions, my concern is it's a vital tool that needs to be protected not just for now, but for the future. And some of the things that we see going on may feel good at the moment because they're quicker than other things that have longer life spans in terms of the world cooperating with them. But ultimately, could end up limiting the long-term effectiveness of sanctions. And I think the things that I described are a snapshot, not necessarily the permanent future state.
Yeah, I completely agree, and I think that really you can see all of those dynamics coming to a head in the Russia case. You know, that if you had not had globalization along the lines that you were describing, the Russia sanctions simply would not have worked. You know, they were sanctions that were finely focused on individual actors, individual entities, and their individual debts. And that's not the kind of thing that we could have even done 40 years ago, potentially.
Well, I can tell you just as a bureaucratic matter, one of the things we did on the Russia sanctions was we brought together all three different branches of Treasury. You know, Treasury has one silo that is a domestic focus, another silo that is an international economic focus, a third that looks at issues related to sanctions. In order to do the kind of surgical targeting, you have to know an awful lot about what's going on in your domestic financial institutions and international financial institutions, what the flows of transactions are, what the likelihood is that the failure of an institution in one country could lead to the failure of an institution in another country, and the chain of events. So why did this matter so much? When we were designing the Russia sanctions, our goal was to keep Europe on board at a time when there was a lot of skepticism that Europe would have the stomach lining to stare Russia down, and they were buying their natural gas from Russia. They had financial institutions that were more closely tied to Russia. They barely emerged from the recession. We were quite a few years ahead of them. We wanted them to be on board. Now, if the spillover effect would have caused as much damage to France and Germany and Italy as it did to Russia, that wasn't a durable coalition.
Yeah.
If you identified the points of contact in Russia that had the most impact on both Putin and the people close to Putin, you could put an awful lot of pressure on them and minimize those spillover effects. And I think it's the perfect example of where measuring twice and cutting once is highly desirable. Because if you end up putting a sanction in place and then you have to roll it back because your ally says it's just too painful, well, we see how unpleasant that looks. There's almost no good way to explain it when it's removing pressure from the intended target, because you don't really want to hurt the innocent bystander. And the goal of concentrating the pressure on the intended place and minimizing it in the unintended place can look to an outsider like you're pulling your punches.
Right.
It can look as if you could have done more and you didn't.
Right.
I would argue that it's aiming and hitting a bullseye and doing the most you can with what you really can put in place. The other thing is that sanctions are most effective when there's a perception that if you don't get your way, you can and will do more. We saw that in the Iran sanctions quite clearly. Bluffing is not a great way to gain pressure. If it's clear that you can't hold your position, your goal is not just to impose pain. Your goal is to cause a change of policy. Well, once your move is exposed as something that you can't sustain, you've taken away the principal objective of the sanction, which is driving a change in the target country. So having that durability, that resilience, that ability to stay with it, and to do more and to increase the pressure is part of an effective sanctions regime. And in the case of Iran, I think you and I were both working on this. There was a question as to whether or not countries that were highly dependent on Iranian oil should each be treated the same in terms of reducing how much oil they imported from Iran. Now, for China, for India, for South Korea, I could fill my fingers with countries where there was an amount of oil where if they didn't bring it in, their economies were going to just suffer terribly. And we had a kind of bespoke approach of being flexible on what reduction over what period of time would be deemed compliant. And I actually think that notwithstanding the rhetoric of the current approach, We're seeing some of that even in the implementation
Right.
of the current sanctions program, because you have to keep all of the parties, online. If everyone were to violate your sanctions regime simultaneously, you lose the ability to sustain it. You can't take action against every country in the world. You can't shut down the global economy. So there has to be some ability to do things that are credible, sustainable, and painful, where you can keep doing more and more, and it has to be married to diplomacy, because you're trying to accomplish a diplomatic end. It can't just be, a punch in the nose for the sake of a punch in the nose.
Well, the other challenge that comes along with this too is if you aim really, really high and you miss, then you've always got that temptation at home too. Well, that means I have to do something even more extreme down the road. And I think one of the things that I've been struck by in our conversations has been our agreed and mutual view that you need to keep things in perspective and in balance. You need to prioritize your various different elements of statecraft. But if you become so absolutely entrenched in, I must get a solution to this problem because my credibility is now at stake, and I've said that we're going to get Iran to zero, and if we don't get Iran to zero by May, then there will be a global catastrophe, then you start feeding yourself into a downward spiral, really, where you make decisions that are increasingly capricious, increasingly reckless, and don't have that same level of thoughtfulness, which to me also goes back to the Deripaska sanctions. And I want to be maybe a little bit sharply focused here. Every one of the points you made about bringing together the various different branches of the Treasury Department and having a thoughtful examination as to what would happen, in my opinion, appear not to have happened in the Deripaska sanctions, where you had a decision to act that was made for political reasons, that was carried out in a fairly reckless way without the thoughtful analysis, and then when it came time to take it off, because of the restrictions on executive action that have come into place, you didn't have that ability to do so in a very coherent sort of way. So it almost seems to me that that is a textbook example of how not to impose those sorts of sanctions.
Well, look, I can tell you, and you probably remember, we looked at each of the sectors in the Russian economy and did extensive analysis of what the spillover would be to neighboring countries, to Western Europe, to the global economy. We, I think, would have seen the potential of there being an unintended consequence that would make it unsustainable. I can't speak to what the analysis was done. I wasn't there. I do know how much effort we put into understanding that in advance, because I think doing it right the first time is much more effective, and there's, under the best of circumstances, almost no explanation of why you're reversing it when you didn't accomplish the policy goal of the sanctions in an intermediate action. Yeah. I think this administration has a particular problem, and it's one of the reasons that Congress passed a law limiting their executive authority, because their credibility on Russia has been damaged. I have a high degree of confidence that the Treasury staff, the OFAC staff, continues to do things by the book. I mean, none of the people that I knew there would have done anything just because they were told to do it. Yeah. It's a really good professional team. I don't know that there's any way of explaining what happened there that would meet a public test of comfort right now, even if the analysis is solid. And that's bad. Yeah. That's bad, because it means your credibility is wounded as a foreign policy actor, as a nation, and it means you're very unlikely to accomplish your objective.
It also means, I think too, I agree, and I especially agree on the quality of the folks at the Treasury Department who are pushing this information up, but the same thing without the State Department and other places too. The problem is now that even solutions that may make sense are going to seem like they're wrong. And it's very dangerous from a diplomatic standpoint, because one could even imagine an agreement coming out between Europe and Russia and Ukraine, for instance, that would try and sort out the Ukraine issue, and that to come back to the United States for sanctions relief under CATSA, and not a lot of people believing that it's legitimate. Right. And I think those are the kinds of issues that over a period of time start to snowball.
Well, look, you can look at the Iran agreement, the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, And I continue to believe that we accomplished the goal of having Iran dismantle its nuclear weapons program and made the world safer because of that. We didn't convince everyone. We convinced enough people that we could implement the agreement. If our credibility had been damaged before we did that, I'm not sure it would have been something that we could have sustained, even in the process that we had to clear back when it was agreed to. And I think that's the situation the administration finds itself in. I guarantee you that were Russia and Ukraine to agree, it would not be perfect.
Yeah.
Those kinds of agreements are never perfect. And it would be a judgment call as to whether or not it met a standard to roll back the sanctions. And you have to, as the one who imposes the sanctions, have the credibility to certify that the results warrant the removal of the sanctions. And if you don't have that credibility, it makes the whole process much, much less likely to succeed.
And you also have to then deal with the issue of differing views about that agreement between the United States and Europe, for instance. And one of the comments that you made about the coordination between the United States and Europe, I thought was very important. We very much prided ourselves, and I would say as a civil servant who worked in the Bush administration before it, on a level of coordination that existed amongst at least the staff level people to work through these things. That doesn't necessarily appear to be happening on a fairly regular basis. But it leads to a kind of a bigger question. What's your sense of the overall U.S.-European relationship? I think that we see lots of points of friction, certainly. NATO policy, trade policy. We see a lot of concerns with regard to kind of ancillary issues about Israel and the Golan Heights, for instance. We see issues about what's going on with refugees here in the United States. But do you have a sense of kind of whether or not we're doing long-term damage, whether or not the long-term interests are sufficient to override that? And then kind of related to that, let's expand out a little bit and talk a little bit about kind of great power relationships and dynamics more generally.
So the question of economic statecraft is far larger than sanctions. It includes how you use your tariffs, how you open your markets, whether you use carrots to bring other countries closer to you or sticks to punish them. And we're right now at a moment, unlike any that we've been at in my professional life, where we are being very aggressive almost on everything, and our degree of collaboration consultation is at a low point. I think that's a problem. I think that unilateral action on trade, unilateral action on sanctions, these are all things that you should reserve the right to do when you need to. You should not relinquish your sovereign right to act. On the other hand, if you look at what we accomplished after World War II in building the Atlantic Alliance and in driving both an economic and a geopolitical agenda forward, it's probably the most successful example of economic statecraft in history. I mean, the Marshall Plan was profoundly in the U.S. interest. We had a market for our products, and we had people who were open to our ideas, and we brought them together, and we created we rebuilt Europe out of the ashes, mostly in our own image in terms of democratic institutions and shared values. For us now to, as a government, deal with Europe with a level of hostility and antagonism that we used to reserve for our enemies is something that I just think is a dreadful mistake. That doesn't mean we always agree with Europe. You just recently wrote a piece, which I thought was very good, on how often we've disagreed with Europe on sanctions issues. We haven't always agreed, but we've tried to bring them along, and we've been most successful when we've brought them along. I mean, Iran is probably the best case of bringing the whole world together. There was literally no other major actor in the world that didn't agree the world would be a safer place if Iran didn't have a nuclear weapon and if we didn't have a nuclear arms race in the Middle East. And we worked with Europe, which had much more economic ties to Iran. We worked with China, that had much more economic ties with Iran. and with South Korea and Japan and even Russia when we were fighting with Russia on Ukraine. So we put together an international effort which I think put an unprecedented amount of pressure on Iran. I think right now we're unilaterally putting an enormous amount of pressure on Iran, but we're doing it at a very high price.
Yeah.
We're doing it at the price of having all of our allies, from Europe to Japan, to South Korea, all of our allies questioning what we're doing, questioning whether we are going beyond what is a reasonable boundary of unilateral behavior. And they're only going along because it's in their immediate interest now not to lose access to the U.S. economy. But they're doing everything they can to figure out how not to get caught in that position in the future.
Yeah.
They're developing mechanisms to try and arrange for flows of business. We don't know how much cheating is going on. I suspect there's more cheating going on than there was when we were working together, and we won't know that for some time. And we're losing our moral authority to bring them along for ultimately what has to be another negotiation at some point if this is going to continue to prevent Iran from having a nuclear weapon. Let's remember that Iran is not likely to stay on its course of foregoing developing a nuclear weapon if all they do is pay the price that they pay when they do develop a nuclear weapon. They had decided it was in their national interest to have a nuclear weapon. Because of sanctions, they changed that decision. If they don't get the sanctions relief, at some point, they will change their decision. Now, I don't think they're doing that now.
Yeah.
I think they are hoping that the United States ultimately comes back to the agreement, or that Europe finds a way to create economic relief without the United States. That's not a great situation. If your goal was to stop Iran from having a nuclear weapon, that is not more likely to lead to a good outcome than where we were under the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action. So if your primary goal was to prevent Iran from having a nuclear weapon, right now that is more of a risk of happening than it was before. Europe is less likely to be in a position where they continue to put the pressure on. And I hate to say this, we're depending on Iran, restraining itself because something better may happen in a couple of years' time. And I don't like to rely on one of the worst regimes in the world to do the right thing. But that's where we are right now because of the decisions we've made. I think the U.S.-Europe relationship is much more difficult now. It wasn't so easy before. I mean, when we agreed to the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, one of the questions was, how much relief do you give Iran because there's a nuclear deal? Our sanctions against Iran fall into multiple buckets. We have sanctions that are based on their nuclear program. Those were what we were removing. We also have separate sanctions based on their support of terrorism, based on their regional destabilization activities, and based on their human rights violations. We didn't remove any of the sanctions in those last three baskets, nor did Iran stop the malign activities that gave rise to those sanctions. So we were in a position on the signing of the Iran agreement where the question was, how does Iran get the benefit of having nuclear sanctions removed? They were very unhappy that banks still didn't want to do business with them, and major businesses didn't want to do business with them, and they argued that we didn't keep our deal. I had to go around the world arguing to our allies that we were keeping the deal to the letter of the deal, and then some. We were issuing licenses where it was appropriate to make clear that things were not in violation of the agreement. But if Iran wanted to re-enter the general world of nations, they had to stop doing these other things. And they also had other problems in terms of the corruption of their financial institutions, that people didn't really want to do business with their banks anyway. Now, in the current situation, where the U.S. has withdrawn from an agreement when Iran was complying with the agreement, our ability to make the argument I just made is weakened.
Yeah.
And I was never pleased that we had greater unity on nuclear than we did on these other issues. I thought the whole world should have been with us on issues related to terrorism and regional destabilization, but we never had the same unity on those issues. And if anything good comes of this, the thing that could come from this is that there is a broader view amongst nations that Iran needs to clean up more than just its nuclear program, and there's the kind of pressure to dial down their other malign activities. I don't know that our unilateral action will accomplish that, but to the extent that I always look for a silver lining, that's the silver lining I look for.
Well, this is where one of the points that was made, and it was made by the Obama administration, it was made by people recently in the Obama administration like myself, was that Iran was not going to reform itself immediately and overnight. But one could imagine that with some amount of international engagement, international openness, a little bit of transparency, over time you could see at least pressures emerge within the regime where people who were inclined to try and reform the system would have at least an opportunity to do so. And arguably, it's very interesting, we've seen that out of the Iranians. We've seen a good faith attempt, I think, on the part of the Iranian government, the Rouhani administration, to implement the Financial Action Task Force recommendations, for instance.
They were doing that at the end of our time. They're making progress. They weren't all the way there, but they were making progress.
Yeah. And look, they've still got issues with how they're carving out the definition of terrorism. I mean, Hezbollah is never going to be an entity they're going to say they're going to agree as a terrorist actor. Although, frankly, it's hard enough trying to get our European friends to agree with a common definition of Hezbollah either. But what's interesting about that, to my mind, is that the reform that we started to see inside of Iran may actually, over time, have had some sort of positive impact in terms of Iranian behavior and Iranian cooperation. I think one of the problems that we now have is the voices inside of Iran who are saying, actually, this does demonstrate that any kind of exposure and vulnerability to the outside world is a vulnerability that we need to shut down. And it strikes me that that is not the kind of dynamic we want ongoing inside of a country like Iran, especially one where it certainly is a regime that is engaged in a lot of bad acts. It certainly is a regime that right now is engaged in a lot of things that are hostile to the United States, but it's there. And it's a country that we're going to have to try and deal with. But this takes us back to the issue of perfect being the enemy of the good. And it strikes me that we've had similar conversations about a place like China historically, where for the longest time, the United States had a lot of good reasons to have concerns with what Chinese behavior was. Then we saw moments in which China was engaged in reform. We saw at least some indication that there was an opening there, and now we may not see that as much. But I wonder if you could give us a sense of how you've seen China issues, especially you've got a nice wide view of from the 90s all the way through of how China has tried to change over time, especially since Tiananmen Square. And I'd be curious what you think about what they've done, how the U.S. is either encouraging or discouraging that, and what we should make out of the Belt and Road Initiative and some of these more expansive approaches of economic statecraft by China.
So I'm happy to make the transition to China, but first let me just make 2 points about the reformers and Hezbollah. I think we actually made some progress getting the Europeans to think that Hezbollah is a terrorist organization, and I think the only way Iran will ever accept it is if the weight of the world tells them you can't commune amongst the nations of the world if we don't agree that this is a terrorist organization. We didn't have 100%, but we were making progress. It shouldn't have been as hard as it was. On the reformers, I think it's easy to overstate the power the reformers in Iran have. I think the Iranian people want there to be reform. I think the reformers in the government are constantly fighting an uphill battle with power that's divided, so that the Revolutionary Guard has enormous access to both resources and power, and it I think was important that the message be that the reformers were empowered by the JCPOA, but I think we always had to have modest expectations of how far that would go.
Agreed.
On China, you know, the period of my engagement with China was most intense, starting when I was at the State Department and then at Treasury. And it was fascinating to me that even in the span of time from 2009 to 2017, China was on a pathway where it was moving from being the largest developing country in the world to being the second largest economy, on its way to being the largest economy in the world. It was not over a 50-year period that happened.
Right.
I mean, I tried engaging with counterparts in 2009. Could we work together on development projects? And what I was told was, we're a developing country.
Right.
We do not do development, we do commerce. And you know, by 2016, 17, you know, the Belt and Road Initiative is China trying to assert itself in the world, both bilaterally and in the creation of new multilateral bodies. That's a pretty rapid change. I think the underlying issues are changing less quickly. They're changing, but you know, no question but that after the, you know, China's entry into the WTO and the reforms, you know, both before and after, China opened itself to the world in a way that it never had, and the result was a degree of economic growth that is unequaled in history in terms of a country both growing and reducing poverty. That doesn't mean they created a full open market economy,
Right.
And it certainly doesn't mean they created a Jeffersonian democracy.
Right.
You know, they have a different system, and it probably is wrong for us to think we're ever going to see them change their system in a kind of turning a switch. But it doesn't mean we have to be inevitably headed towards conflict. And I think if you look at the list of issues that are currently a source of such enormous tension between the United States and China, they're not new issues. I mean, we did resolve some issues. I mean, I think it's quite notable that when I became Secretary of Treasury, the issue of currency manipulation was a red-hot issue. You could almost not get to any other issue. And by the time my tenure was over, you had to, if you were going to be fair, say that their currency was roughly in equilibrium. You know, it was not a free market exchange rate. They were intervening to defend their currency, but that was in a way that hurt them in terms of foreign trade, not help them. So we didn't complain about it. It doesn't erase the fact that for over a decade, their interventions went the other way, and they were gaining unfair advantage. Now, I think through constructive engagement and through helping them see what was in their self-interest, we did help empower reformers to cause the kinds of changes that make that issue, which was for a period of time the thing most likely to drive us to conflict, to resolve it. I hope it stays resolved. We won't be in a better place, either bilaterally or in terms of global stability, if that becomes an issue of contention again. You know, other issues, whether it's excess capacity in sectors like steel and aluminum, or protection or non-protection of intellectual property, openness of markets to foreign products and foreign investment, there's still a lot of work to be done. I think even in the last months, they've done some things that have moved in the right direction, but the devil is always in the detail. And whether or not that has the effect of changing the impression, which up until very recently was it's getting harder, not easier, to do business in China if you're from another country. Right. That has to change. It has to change in order for the tension to go down, and in order for there to be better economic conditions here, there, and globally. The world needs for U.S. and China to find a way to not be in a trade war. You cannot have the two largest economies of the world in a trade war without hurting the global economy. The mode of engagement right now, I don't think is a very productive one. I think the unilateral tariffs are doing as much harm here as they're doing in China. It's making prices go up in the United States. It's causing manufacturers to become non-competitive in the United States. I think China will kind of absorb the pain of tariffs if they have to, and they're only going to enter into an agreement if they consider it to be on a mutually beneficial basis. I think the issue of respect in a relationship, you can disagree deeply on issues, whether it's an economic issue or a security issue, without treating the other country with a degree of disrespect that makes it look like capitulation if they make an agreement that's in mutual interests. You have to keep a pathway open for there to be a face-saving way for there to be an agreement. I'm hopeful that there will be a resolution of the current trade issues, but I don't think we're there yet. The reports I read coming out of the last round of meetings didn't leave me feeling like we were one more conversation away. The conversation that I had when I was in China last week led me to believe that there was still a fair amount of work to do. Ultimately, the United States has to protect itself from unfair practices, which is why we were very hard when we engaged with China on issues like currency and theft of intellectual property, and we made real progress through constructive engagement. It didn't solve the whole problem. I don't know that the current approach will solve the whole problem. I'm skeptical, highly skeptical. What I think will come out of this mode of engagement is a lingering sense that conflict is inevitable. And I don't think that's good. I think the objective, there's this idea that's gained currency that there's a Thucydides trap.
Right.
The great power has to act to keep the rising power out. And there is a certain natural tendency, but it takes leaders to keep that from becoming an inevitability. You asked about the Belt and Road Initiative.
Yeah.
I have very mixed feelings about the Belt and Road Initiative. On the one hand, and we said this publicly at the time, it's a positive thing if China provides capital for infrastructure development in parts of the world that have huge need for infrastructure development. My concern has always been on what terms it's provided.
Right.
Is it provided in a way that leaves a country with a non-sustainable debt? Is it provided in a way that destabilizes the local economy where the project is being built? We had to decide what our response would be, for example, to the Asia Infrastructure Bank.
I was going to ask you about that.
And just to set it in the context of time, China's initiative to create a new multilateral lending institution was launched roughly halfway through the 5 years when the United States was trying to ratify IMF reforms that were agreed to during the financial crisis. If you remember, China stepped up and helped stimulate their economy to help turn around the global financial crisis. The IMF used massive amounts of resources. You had to refill the IMF coffers. It was done in a stopgap way. The permanent solution was supposed to be with a reallocation of rights at the IMF to reflect the growth of developing economies like China and the relative smaller size of developed economies, particularly in Europe. Every country in the world had approved it but the United States. There was a great frustration. That was the environment in which China went out to raise money for a new multilateral institution. Now, as the person who had to spend 5 years of my life convincing Congress to ratify the IMF quota reforms, I can tell you with absolute certainty that there was no option for the United States to join the Asia Infrastructure Bank. It just wasn't, it wouldn't have been a credible pledge. It wouldn't have happened even if a president had agreed to it. Our mode of engagement on that was to tell other countries, before you join, make sure that China sets it up in a way where they won't create non-sustainable debt loads, where they won't destabilize local economies, where they won't have all of the negative possible outcomes that we worried about. we were a little frustrated that there was a bit of a race to the bottom to win favor with China that weakened some of that leverage, when the UK signed on and then other European countries did. We were separately working with countries like Australia and South Korea that wanted to go in and were going to go in to put maximum pressure on China to have the highest possible standards.
Right.
And the ability to do that was very much diluted because once Europe jumped in, it was a done deal. Now, what we did manage to do, even after that, was to work with China and the older international financial institutions to work on an approach where the bank in its early years would co-lend with the World Bank, with the Asia Development Bank, all institutions that had standards that were designed to avoid the problems we were worried about. I'm not actually sure whether they've made a loan that hasn't been co-financed at this point. The last time I checked, they hadn't. And I think as a result, they've been meeting the standards through AIIB that we worried about. I don't know what will happen when they start lending on their own. And I hope that the practice is one that will be carried forward. I think on some of the separate Belt and Road Initiative bilateral financings, there are some problems. Yeah. Pakistan has come into the IMF now for a package. Wasn't helped by the fact that they took on debt that they couldn't afford.
Right, right. Well, and this actually goes to the broader question of what China is doing kind of geopolitically, and oftentimes that can be taken in a direction of U.S. dollar dominance, and whether or not the renminbi is something that's going to displace the U.S. currency, and whether or not we're going to see China take the place in the United States as providing the global reserves and so forth. It strikes me that that is an important set of issues. It's an important set of questions, but it also can be overwrought. And that there probably is going to be a change to how the global economy works just by virtue of the fact that we've got a lot bigger economies beyond the United States that are potentially going to be in those positions. But that the role of the dollar, at least as of today, has yet really to diminish. How do you see the role of the dollar, both in terms of its value for the United States, but how do you see it vis-a-vis some of these other countries that are rising?
I think that for the foreseeable future, the next 5-10 years, there's no competitor on the horizon. European growth and the euro are not an option. Japan has had decades of very subpar economic growth, and the currency has remained strong because it's a safe haven, but it's not an alternative to the dollar. China is kind of in between. When I was at Treasury, China was brought into the IMF special drawing rights basket. It's something that we worked with them on to make the kinds of reforms that would make the RMB more freely convertible, to limit the ability to stop the flow of capital. One could have decided it either way, but they'd moved enough, and the truth is the special drawing rights basket does not immediately make you a global currency. It's a step along the way. I don't think China is ready yet to have the RMB be a full global reserve currency. That would mean relinquishing a degree of control that they're not ready for yet. I think they're happy to have the SDR status. I think they're happy that some of the baskets of international funds, like the MSCI fund, includes Chinese securities. But they also are happy that in a crisis they would have a little bit more ability to step in than they would be able to retain if they were to make the RMB 100% market oriented and 100% convertible with no ability to have capital controls in normal circumstances. I think it's a mistake, however, to think that the snapshot for the foreseeable future is a permanent condition.
Right.
before the Great Depression and World War II, nobody thought that sterling was going to stop being the world's reserve currency. In 1970, 1980, everyone thought Japan was unstoppable, and then it wasn't. None of us knows what the economy of the next 20, 30 years will look like. And what I worry about in some of the practices that we're following now in the United States is that if you could pick the policy steps you would take to accelerate the move away from the dollar, we seem to be doing all those things. Start with our fiscal policy, running enormous deficits, for tax cuts that serve very little useful purpose at a time of growth. Now that means we have to borrow more on the global markets, and that means that our trade deficit will continue to grow, and that's not a sign of strength. The unilateral imposition of sanctions, it creates more incentives to try to find a way to do business in other currencies. So it was not a surprise when Iran's first two stops after we unilaterally imposed sanctions were to Beijing and Moscow. And there has been an uptick in oil trading in RMB. Not enough to push the dollar aside, but it's just a beginning of a move. I think that the status quo is the status quo until it's not.
Right.
And if you look at the profound value to the United States, the whole conversation we had about the use of sanctions, if the dollar was not the world's reserve currency, we wouldn't have that great capacity. We think of globalization in terms of it's become popular to describe globalization in negative terms. It exposes us to more competition and a loss to manufacturing jobs. How much that's globalization and how much it's technology, you can debate. Excuse me. What's clear is that it's given us this singular ability to project influence. Excuse me.
Well, and I think, what I would say too is that beyond giving us the ability to project influence, it's given us the ability to project influence in a way that actually has got, tremendous benefits to ourselves as well, kind of intrinsically. And it's that intrinsic benefit that we potentially run the risk of losing in addition to the policy ones. And it strikes me that this is a conversation that ought to be had every time a new sanctions bill is being deliberated on Capitol Hill. I mean, it's certainly something that we talked about when we were talking about sanctions decisions, sitting around the deputies, committee room, not all together and not always necessarily as coherently and cogently as we should have. But it strikes me that as this administration pursues sanctions against Venezuela, as they pursue sanctions against Iran, as they are given sanctions against Russia that they need to impose, it's that lack of prioritization that runs headlong into the trade policies. And if you didn't have trade policies the way they are, you at least would have that amount of flexibility, which is not the case now.
I think that's right. I apologize. I brought a cold back from Asia.
Yeah.
The simultaneous increase in unilateral sanctions and unilateral trade tariffs is it's just a lot of pressure on the system. And I don't think it's going to have the immediate effect of having the world leave the dollar.
Right.
It may not happen for 25 or 50 years, but it's not a good thing if the Europeans are trying to figure out how to work around the dollar.
Yeah.
It's not a good thing if there's a pressure to trade more commodities like oil and other currencies. If you valued the benefit you get from being the world's reserve currency, you would exercise caution in doing the things that threaten it. Which is not to say that you wouldn't ever take those kinds of actions.
Right.
You would just do them in a thoughtful, careful way. And at the moment, there is not a sense around the world that the United States is behaving that way.
Right.
It's that we do things because we can, and it's because we have the desire to act on our own, partially because we don't have the patience for the multilateral processes, partially because it takes longer to do it that way, and partially because it's been characterized as weak to do it in the careful way. I would argue it's exactly the opposite.
Yeah.
It's not weak to do things in an effective, lasting, durable way. And it's not strong to do things that may or may not accomplish short-term goals with very high potential long-term costs. And I think there's a tension right now that what I'm describing is in some circles seen as accepting that we have to live with the consequences of China's actions on currency, accepting we have to live with the fact that Iran is still doing a lot of bad things in the world. I don't think that's true. I think we moved China more than we got credit for moving China, and I think that if these tactics work, it will be to gain the kinds of incremental gains at a much higher price. I think on Iran, we got a nuclear agreement that's now in jeopardy. And worse than supporting terrorism with conventional weapons is the nightmarish prospect of having a country that supports terrorism have nuclear weapons. So, I think it's a question of prioritizing goals and understanding that you can't solve things 100%. And if you get the most important things taken care of, the world's a better place and the U.S. is stronger. And I hope we end up with a kind of a political debate that allows that to be debated. I suspect on an issue like China, it may or may not be the case that the political debate brings it to a better place. I suspect there's an equal chance that the political debate becomes a bidding war to be tougher on China. And I think that's the reason why China ought to make the kinds of moves that show the reformers are still in a position to implement policy, because it could get worse as much as it could get better. And that's asking a lot when there's this kind of torrent of unilateral action and quite disrespectful tactics.
Well, and in part, it speaks back to this question about what Iranian policy is and what a lot of countries' policies are around the world of whether or not they're waiting and holding their breath over the course of the next 2 years and waiting to see what happens in 2021.
I think there is an extent to which the world is holding its breath. I mean, I don't remember 2 years in the last 20 when we haven't had the kind of crisis that you couldn't put off. Don't think it's an accident.
Yeah.
I think there is a certain amount that the world is hoping. Even our adversaries counted on the United States as an anchor of stability in the world.
Yeah.
And I think that the power we got for about 70 years after World War II by being the anchor of stability in the world may be unprecedented in history. And I think our chance of having the amount of trust we had before is hurt by the fact that once you've proven that you can do it a different way, it may never be the same. But I think the world wants us to be back in that place, and it is recoverable, but not without a great deal of repair work.
And what's also interesting to me is you sit back and you think about hegemonic transitions, what you find is there will be a successor. There will be a successor arrangement. There has been, at least in human history, but the process of getting from one to the other tends to be very messy, very unpleasant, and very difficult. And especially when you consider the benefits that we've gotten thus far from the position that we've had, that's a very nerve-wracking sort of position to be in.
I think it's also important to remember that the power we have is not just military power, and it's not just economic power. The moral leadership of the world is an extraordinary kind of power. For others to want to be more like you is power. And that's something that we shouldn't take for granted.
Well, with that, I think we're going to transition to giving you the opportunity and the audience to ask some questions. We have got a microphone in the back, and we have a gentleman in the back to pass the microphone. So we will go back and forth. We're going to go up here to this gentleman up front. And I would ask you please to state your question and to keep it pretty short, because we've got a number of people whose hands came up.
Right, of course. I'm concerned that the current administration seems to be, one of their policies seems to be sort of the rebirth of mercantilism.
The
rebirth of mercantilism, which of course gives a particular context and a motivation for economic statecraft, reduce imports, increase exports. The tariffs and things, I think in part they seem more willing than they might otherwise be to impose tariffs because they do help them achieve the mercantilist goal. But on the other side, looking beyond sort of tariffs for the purposes of sanctions, increasing exports, the current administration seems to be very happy to increase the exports of fossil fuels, coal, oil, gas. And in part, that's for the purely mercantilist goal of increasing exports, but it also is to accomplish diplomatic goals like displacing Russian gas supplies and doing other such things. The concern is, of course, that these short-term goals have very long-term impacts, where by reducing the prices of fossil fuels overseas, by shipping so much of our national resources, we're discouraging other people from moving to the renewables, which I think we all should agree are in everybody's best interest long-term. So can you talk about, sort of in that context perhaps, how do we balance the short term against the long term? And, is mercantilism the right way to go? I assume you would say no.
Yeah, I don't think that we'll have a more prosperous and more peaceful world if we have a return to mercantilism. I think we've lived the history of doing business that way. I think that you're seeing a lot of attention to reducing imports and mostly exporting things like agricultural commodities and minerals. I would take a slightly different view on energy, and I think it makes a big difference if you're talking about LNG or coal. This administration withdrew from the Paris Agreement. We went into the Paris Agreement and we leveraged our ability to work with China to get the developing world to come into the Paris Agreement. And I can see that exporting more LNG is a way of cementing that relationship. The problem is we don't currently have an administration that supports the Paris Agreement, so we're not getting the benefit of that. So it looks more like mercantilism now than it would look like if it was part of a larger strategy to not just treat it as a one-off economic issue, but as part of a global relationship. The risk of cutting each of the countries or regions of the world off from each other is not a happy one. It will lead to lower growth and more conflict, ultimately. I don't think that right answer is for us to be open and everyone else to be closed. There has to be mutuality. I mean, the problem with China was that they didn't open their markets when we opened our markets. Now, you could say they were a developing economy, they weren't ready, but that explanation works better when you have one of the highest rates of poverty in the world than when you've brought so many people out of poverty and you're approaching middle income status. And everyone's self-image has to evolve with changing circumstances. So I'm not sure that I've answered your question completely, but I guess I wouldn't view it just through the lens of mercantilism. So selling LNG can be more than selling LNG. I think the mistake in our policy now is that we're not linking our economic activities to broader issues and using it as a way to advance national interests more broadly. And I think the more we look like we're building a moat around the United States, the less ability we have to do that.
This gentleman up here.
So I have two quick questions. One, when you're formulating the sanctions protocol, how do you take into consideration the support of the American citizen for those sanctions in order for them to not be disagreed with? And the second one, when you're trying to control for the spillover effects of the sanction with respect to other countries, what benchmarks do you use, or how do you know that that your conclusions are the ones that have the strength to accomplish the objectives and not allow, let's say, a country like Russia, somehow a pathway out of it when they counter-respond?
So on the first, it's hard to have a dialogue with the public on the impacts of sanctions, but I can tell you from experience, you hear loud and clear from the businesses who are affected by sanctions, and you know exactly what they're worried about in terms of loss of business, of potential retaliation by the country where they have large investments. And you try and figure out how to minimize the damage to U.S. businesses without taking the policy and making it ineffective. I actually found that most CEOs were actually pretty patriotic. They came in and they made their case and they explained what they saw as a problem. And sometimes they helped us see things that timing could make a big difference, where, you know, if you were going to cause a U.S. company to breach a contract so that Russia would have a windfall, they got most of the benefit, but they wouldn't have to pay. You're not hurting Russia by having a rigid approach that says, you know, the date is the date and everything. You can work your way around things like that. I had some CEOs, you know, say to me, "Look, I disagree with your policy, but I will live 100% within it. And here are the things that, you know, would just do extraordinary damage that you don't really mean." You know, then there were others who would say, only one foreign policy, and we have a huge investment in Russia, and yes, we could lose that, but you have to do what's right for the United States and for the global objective. So you had a full range of feedback, but there was no lack of visibility as to what the affected businesses thought they would experience or thought you should do to minimize the harm. It's a very good question. How do you target so that you keep the pressure on and you don't let so much off that it becomes ineffective? You know, we started with Russia with a very small bank, you know, Bank Rossiya. Now, why did we pick Bank Rossiya? Because all of Putin's inner circle banked there. We put the pressure directly on the people who were closest to Putin. They noticed. They felt the pain. Now, if we'd gone to the largest commercial banks in Russia and sanctioned them and killed the Russian economy so that the consumer was hurt, you know, in every aspect of their life, we would have just speeded up the process of nationalism rising and supporting Putin, and any chance we had of accomplishing our goal would have been diminished. If it spilled over to the point where Europe was screaming, we can't live with this, we're going to go back into recession, our capability of effectively putting pressure on Russia would have been limited. So I think if you look at what we accomplished, it would be easy to say, well, Russia's still in Ukraine, you didn't accomplish anything. I don't think that's true. I think we can't take full credit for the sanctions because you also had the price of oil dropping and Russia was suffering economically because of that. That gave our sanctions in some ways more power because it was like the last straw. They agreed to a diplomatic framework to try and work through the issues with Ukraine. They stopped what was at that point still a continuing westward move through Ukraine. You know, you could say that they froze the conflict. Maybe they froze it a little bit before they would have. But, you know, time will tell whether the Minsk Accords produce an agreement. I don't think the Minsk Accords would have happened if there hadn't been sanctions. And I don't think it would have happened if Europe hadn't had the commitment to sticking with us well beyond what Russia thought Europe would be willing to tolerate. I think in some ways beyond what Europe thought Europe would be willing to tolerate. Now, partially it was because Russia was behaving so badly that it made it almost impossible for them to weaken their resolve. But remember, at that point in time, most of Europe was still technically in recession. You know, it was not, the recovery here is a record-long recovery. The recovery in Europe from the financial crisis was slow and shallow. And here we are, the country that they could say, you caused the financial crisis that we're digging our way out of. Now you want us to go back into another recession. You know, that was, you know, it didn't have to be said in those terms. We were aware of that. I will also say, from our perspective, watching the U.S. economy, you know, our trading relationships aren't that complicated. You know, our biggest trading partners are Europe and, you know, China and North America. You know, if Europe went into recession, that was the biggest risk of a double-dip recession in the United States. So you asked me about worrying about public support for sanctions. Causing a recession probably wouldn't have increased public support for sanctions. So I think we threaded a needle actually quite well. I can't sit here today and say I'm happy that it didn't have better effect. I would be happier if I could say Russia pulled out of Donetsk and Luhansk and was negotiating at least, you know, a future for Crimea. You know, we'll have to get back together in 5 or 10 years and see you know, how the end of the story is written.
More questions? Let's go to the back.
Hi, thank you very much for a very interesting conversation. I wanted to ask a question about climate change and the Paris Agreement, and I suppose I want to frame this within the context of economic statecraft. So this is basically an investment challenge. We need to double the levels of investment in green versus brown technologies, but obviously the current administration is sending a very positive or a very negative signal and is actually incentivizing greater levels of investment in brown versus green assets. And I'm just wondering, if you were working for the next administration, what tools of economic statecraft do you think would be appropriate to try and mobilize, especially within the context of transatlantic relationship, to mobilize, you know, greater momentum behind the kind of catalytic cooperation that is intended under the Paris Agreement? Thank you.
Look, I think what we were doing in the last year of the Obama administration was the right thing. We got the world to agree to a green climate fund. We actually accelerated U.S. contributions to put as much into it as we could during the time we were there with the appropriations that were available. It's very hard to go to developing countries and say, we want you to go to the highest level of capital investment to avoid making the world 1 centigrade warmer. They want to grow just like we wanted to grow. We grew by burning coal. We grew by doing things to our rivers. They're at that stage of development. You have to provide some economic support. And it can't be 100% externally funded. There was a channel of the Paris negotiations on economic tools. There was a meeting in Addis Ababa before the final Paris meeting. And I went to the conference because it was important that the United States be represented at that meeting at the highest level to try and forge a new global approach on how to divide responsibility for dealing with the economic reality that addressing climate change was going to be costly for the developing world. And I was very pleased that at the conference we came out with a 3-legged stool that you couldn't have gotten at an earlier point. Mostly the demand was, we want, you know, official development assistance to pay the bill. We came out with an agreement that there had to be a 3-legged stool of official development assistance, home country budget support, and private sector investment. And one of the big things to come out of that conference was a commitment by the United States, the UK, and the IMF to provide the kinds of technical support to build the financial capabilities for countries in the developing world to have better banking systems, better budget systems, to be able to make that three-legged stool happen. I'm not sure that I can sit here today and say I think the United States is advancing those objectives today the way it was 2 years ago, but I think that's the right approach.
Over here in the back. Yeah.
Hello. I wanted to ask about Venezuela. It's a topic that particularly applies to this topic of sanctions, and I want to know the perception you have of the sanctions regime implemented by the United States. Is it effective? Should it go farther enough, or what are other considerations to be made to resolve this humanitarian crisis? Thank you.
I think Venezuela is a tragedy. Our relations with Venezuela have been as close to non-existent for the last decade as with any country in the world. I think it's actually a testimony to the power of U.S. Economic statecraft that with a country that we're barely connected to, putting sanctions on U.S. oil purchases is having an enormous effect on the economy. It's not that they sell all their oil to the U.S., but they get most of their hard currency from sales of oil to the U.S. Russia will forgive a debt. China will have some long-term, credit facility. The hard currency was coming from the sale of oil to the United States. So we had a disproportionate amount of economic leverage, even in a country that we were barely connected to. So on the one hand, it says something about the enormous power you have. Look, I think that the way they handled the election and the change on the ground in Venezuela deteriorated considerably over the last 2 years from what we were looking at just 2.5 years ago. So the situation got much worse. It wasn't good, and it got worse. I'll give the administration a certain amount of credit that they have gone with a more multilateral approach, bringing many of the nations of the world together on a sanctions approach in Venezuela. Will it be effective? I don't know. I don't see the diplomatic engagement that you need in order to get the kind of outcome that economic pressure is really designed to produce. Now, it may be that it's just a very difficult circumstance because we didn't start out with a diplomatic relationship. We didn't start out with a diplomatic relationship with Iran either. Right. I mean, we'd had no direct. I remember having to choreograph the first conversation that we were going to have with Iran. We had to create the chance meeting, at an international engagement. So I hope that there is a diplomatic process. I don't know that there is an easy solution to Venezuela. It ultimately is something that people of Venezuela are going to have to resolve. And it's not just a question of Venezuela, it's a huge issue for Colombia, which is very sensitive to the flows of people out of Venezuela and to economic distress in Venezuela. I'm not sure that I have a better answer than that. I'm not critical of the desire to change things in Venezuela. I hope that this approach is effective.
All right, we're now going to go into our lightning round. So we're going to take 3 questions at once, so keep your questions very, very, very tight. So we're going to go here in the middle, and then we're going to go here, and then we're going to go up front. And we'll do as many lightning round questions as we can. Go ahead.
Sure. Thanks so much. So my questions relate to TPP. So what were the economic statecraft goals behind the Obama administration's push for TPP? What are the costs of the U.S. retreat from that? And earlier you were saying that the existence of the Thucydides trap really depends on leadership, but couldn't there be an argument for that TPP was an economic containment strategy? How would you respond to that?
All right, and then the gentleman in the whitish shirt, there you go.
who invented the idea, who originated the idea to remove Alexander Hamilton's portrait from the $10 bill?
Okay. And then we'll go to the gentleman in the yellow shirt, or yellow tie.
Thank you. If you were to replace the harsh treatment of China by bringing them to the table with the sanctions or any other of the economic actions that the administration has taken, what would you have done to bring them to the table and keep them there to a final agreement?
All right. TPP, I think, was very good economic statecraft. It started as a conversation between small and relatively insignificant economies with the idea that if the United States entered into an agreement with some smaller economies, the big ones would follow. And the big ones came in. And we worked out an agreement where, notwithstanding the terrible political fallout, it had high labor standards, high environmental standards, it put better business practices in place, and it's actually become the source document for the current administration's negotiations with China and with Canada and Mexico. So for all that the administration withdrew from TPP, when it comes to an issue like currency, they go back and they replicate what we did in TPP. When it comes to labor standards, they are replicating TPP. What have we lost? We created a vacuum, and political nature abhors a vacuum. We created an opening for China and for others to do bilateral and other regional agreements where we don't get to drive the standards, where they're not going to be as strong if we're not there. The TPP minus the U.S. will be close but not as strong, and I think that there's a chance the United States at some point comes back in, but we won't have that leadership role that we had in designing it in the first place. I don't think it's fair to say that it was a containment strategy. I can't tell you how many times I said to my Chinese counterparts, we would welcome you into TPP if you can meet the standards of TPP. Ultimately, if China makes the reforms it needs to make, it should be in a TPP. They're not ready to do it now, but it's the right goal. And I'm not sure they saw it that way. You know, they saw almost everything that we did that could be viewed as adversarial, whether it was a geostrategic issue like the THAAD missiles, where the only way to see what North Korea was doing was to have the missiles there. They viewed it as being to watch them. There was no way to watch North Korea with that. And they would, I can't tell you how many times I had this conversation at the highest levels in China. We genuinely were not looking to watch China or to keep China out. But that's where you have to have relationships of trust where you can have those conversations, where even if there's a sense of growing inevitable conflict, there are these conversations that pull you back to level set. I'm going to get to Hamilton after I do the other one, just because it doesn't flow otherwise. China's a very challenging diplomatic relationship, economic relationship, strategic relationship. I don't think it's a secret that in the military circles, there's been a growing concern for 10, 20 years that their interests and ours ultimately come into conflict. I think the counter to that has been on the economic side, where you could build stronger economic ties and create not a common identity. We're never going to have the United States and China look the same. The question was, could we push them in the right direction enough that it helped us to avoid conflict? China doesn't have a history of territorial expansion. They've got quite a lot of territory. They have quite a lot of people. On the economic side, they definitely have an interest in making sure they have sources
for the natural resources that they need that they don't have, markets for their products. By tying their access to what they want to behaving along the lines of globally accepted rules, by giving them a bigger seat at the table if they did the right things, I think we did move them in the right direction. I don't know that this kind of much more confrontational approach will lead to more than the kinds of progress we got through an approach that I think dialed the temperature down a little bit on conflict. So it's plus, we had a much more complex agenda with China. We had the desire to have China cooperate on the Iran sanctions. We got their cooperation. We had the desire for their cooperation on Paris. We got their cooperation. We had the desire for their cooperation on putting sanctions on the DPRK. And I would say that for a moment, there was a time when I thought the administration's bellicose rhetoric may have actually brought that to a point where they were maybe getting China to do more. I'm not so sure anymore. I'm not so sure. I mean, there's no effective way to put maximum pressure on North Korea without China. And, I hope that they can accomplish that if they need to, but the kind of romance between leaders has not created a clarity of purpose that I think gives us the ability to get the cooperation with China at a time when we're in a trade war with China. So, on Hamilton, it was never a proposal to take Hamilton off the $10 bill. So no one approved a plan to take Hamilton off the $10 bill. The original plan was actually to have multiple $10 bills and to have more places for images. That proved to be not practical. And when that proved to be not practical, we switched to the $20 bill for a bunch of reasons. But it is one of the stories that has told itself in a different way. But if you go back and look at the statements that were made at the time, it was 100% our plan to keep Hamilton on the currency, either in the form he's there now or in a comparable form at all times. Excuse me? There was a discussion amongst the group that does. Well, we redesign our currency periodically for security reasons, regardless of the images. And I, for one, think it's a really important thing for our currency to tell the full story of our country. And I'm very proud of the recommendations that we made. And I'm still hopeful that they endure.
Well, I want to say thank you very much to everybody for joining us here. As I mentioned at the start, the full video recording of this event will be available on our website in a few days. You can also subscribe to our podcast series on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, and lots of other platforms. This is just one of a number of great events we're hosting in the coming weeks. Upcoming events will include on Friday, Financing the Energy Transition, Understanding Green Bonds at the Princeton Club at 9:30. And then most especially of all, next week, we've got the 6th Annual Colombia Global Energy Summit that will actually be held at Alfred Lerner Hall. As I said, Wednesday, April 10th, all day. Speakers include former U.S. Senator of North Dakota Heidi Heitkamp, Megan O'Sullivan, former U.S. government official, and Jean Kirkpatrick, professor of practice of international affairs, and Mona Sutphin, an advisory board member of the Center on Global Energy Policy, and another colleague from the Obama administration.
And Clinton.
And Clinton, yeah. And many, many more. So thank you very much, and let's thank Jack Lew for his participation.
Thank you.